And then they translated the Old Testament to Greek, the Septuagint.
I read it in English.
Do you remember what it looks like? The Greek?
Yeah.
Weird, huh?
Mm-hmm.
The Hebrew is even weirder. Cool. David, are we rolling?
Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good. We might have a couple people filter in. So I've got a lot of information to give you guys, so let's get rolling. As we learned last week, you might not be able to take notes quick enough, which is why I'm sending the link out to everybody on Tuesday with the video. So I'm gonna roll through even a little bit more than I went through last week. So if you weren't here last week, did you get the video okay on email? Get to watch it?
Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
Sounds good. I wanted to hit a little bit more on translations since I didn't get to touch on a whole lot last week. I did a quick, brief introduction, and then I was able to I didn't get to all the information I wanted to get through. So, one last thing on translations is the King James and the New King James Version, which were written, the King James Version was written in 1611. Since 1611, we have found the best and the oldest Greek manuscripts for the New Testament, and the best and the oldest Hebrew manuscripts for the Old Testament. So, the King James Version, while it is written beautifully in High Middle English, was written off of poorer, less accurate manuscripts, and those inaccuracies have been retained to today in the King James. The New King James doesn't even fix those inaccuracies. So, if you're going to pick a Bible, or preferably multiple Bibles to do study with, basically anything but the King James and the New King James is going to be the most accurate.
Killing me.
Yeah, so since then we have discovered thousands of manuscripts. We have improved our Greek original text that through textual criticism we've reconstructed, and there are actually hundreds of inaccuracies in the King James and the New King James that are remedied in all of the other ones. So, yeah, if you want a very literal translation, the NASB tries to keep to some of the language of the King James, but uses the modern manuscripts. So NASB is very literal, like the King James and the New King James, but more accurate. And I found this week, really cool. They just are coming out with a new translation called the CSB, which is supposed to be the most literal and the most readable. All right. So here we've got the graph, like I was saying last week. The NIV, kind of right down the middle, but it is also kind of to the leftmost of all the other translations, except for the NLT, which is super dynamic. So when picking, especially if you're going to pick 2 or 3 different translations, it's good to pick one on the left, one in the middle, one on the right. The more readable, the better, obviously, because if you can't read and understand it very clearly, it's not going to be a lot of good to us. So my recommendation, what I like to use, is the NIV, the NRSV, and the ESV for my 3. When the CSV comes out March 1st, I've already pre-ordered it. I'm actually super giddy about that.
Kind of like the iPhone 9.
Yeah, exactly. I'm more excited about this. I'll let you guys know what it's like. It's supposed to be more readable and more literal than the NRSV, so on that optimal line, but just more of each. So yeah, that's an exciting new development in the world of translations. So yeah, I just wanted to hit on that really quick before we jump into genre analysis and literary context. So last week we went over historical context, getting into the world of the Bible when it was written. We went over covenant, which was super important, and the name Yahweh, which is super important. So now we're going to go on to the literary context, which can be a little bit harder to figure out depending on what passage you're in. Historical context, you can usually go to a good history book and get some good information on it. Literary context, a lot of times you have to just use your common sense, use reading ability, because first and foremost the Bible is human literature and it has to be read and understood that way. So a good rule of thumb is to look at your passage in the context of the surrounding sections of story, especially when we're talking about narratives, and right now we're in historical narratives of the Old Testament, which is going to be our first genre. So since a lot of what we're going to focus on are the narrative parts of the Pentateuch, I'm going to put our focus a little more heavily on the historical narrative. We will hit a little bit on the law portions with the kids, so I will hit on law a little bit, but of course the narrative portions we're going to be focusing on a lot more because the law isn't super necessary to go very in-depth with kids. So ask yourselves these questions as you're going through historical narrative to make sure you're not misunderstanding the point of the author, because our main goal is to find out the purpose of the original author, what he was intending to say, because like I said last week, the original text can never mean what it didn't mean to the original audience. So the first question is, what's the point? When you're in any given section of narrative, any given story, try to trace the author's train of thought. What is the point here? The next one, what is the author saying, and why does he say it right here, as opposed to elsewhere, especially with extra little details in your historical narrative. So narrative means story, and story is always a progression of events. That's what we have to remember, is why did the author choose to put it in this progression? A lot of times when we get to certain historical narratives, in the Old Testament it's not as much of an issue, but in the Gospels it is very much not chronological. So the sequence of events is going to be more topical. In the Old Testament, it's very much chronological because it's the history of Israel. So you're definitely going to want to pay attention to how the narrator moves the story along and use that to figure out his main purpose for each story and section of stories. One more thing to remember is that the literary context is going to depend completely on genre. So when we get to the next portion of Scripture, which will be all the way down to wisdom literature when we hit Job, we are going to go over wisdom literature and how to interpret that as a genre. But for now, for a long time, we'll be set with just this session on historical narrative and law. So before we jump too deep into how to interpret and understand historical narrative and law, I want to just hit on all the different genres of the books of the Bible. I know you guys probably know all of them or most of them, but just in case there are a few you don't know or are less familiar with, I want to go ahead and make sure that we can explain to the kids where we are, where we're going, if they have any questions on, especially because we're going to be discussing genre today, not in so many words. Today it's going to be types of writing. And instead of historical narrative, we're going to just tell them that we're going through the true story, is what we're going to call historical narrative for the kids, just so they have an idea of what we're going to be going through for the next few months. So, Genesis to Esther is the story of God's people from creation to the exile to the return from exile. So from Genesis all the way through Esther, we've got the first 5 books, which are half story, half law, approximately. We'll get more into that. Then the rest is historical narrative all the way through Esther. It is the complete story of Israel. Real quick, the parts of the Pentateuch that have law are most of Exodus, almost all of Leviticus, about half of Numbers, a little more than half of Numbers, and almost all of Deuteronomy. And like we'll get into, a lot of times the law and the historical narrative portions overlap and are a little bit combined. And there's a very good reason for that, and we'll get into that after I finish going through the rest of the Bible. Then Joshua to Esther are straight historical narrative all the way through. Joshua is the conquering of the Promised Land. Judges describes a period of living in the land while it's partially conquered, partially not, and God has to send judges to rule Israel to save them from their enemies, because they have no central leadership after Joshua dies, which was Joshua's only shortcoming listed in the Bible, that he didn't raise up someone after him. Ruth is the short story of a foreigner, Ruth, who marries an Israelite, and we end up finding out that she is an ancestor of David. 1st and 2nd Samuel is the story of Israel being led first by the prophet Samuel, people asking for a king, led by Saul, then by David. 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles actually go through the exact same timeline. So once you finish reading through 1st, 2nd Kings, you start reading through 1st, 2nd Chronicles, you realize you're reading the same story again, just a little bit more dry and detail-oriented. So it's a little less fun in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but they're the history of the kings of Israel, starting from David's son Solomon, all the way through until the Babylonian exile, from the basically 3rd king to the last king. Skip most of that for time. And then we've got Ezra and Nehemiah, which is the return of the Jews from Babylon in the exile back to Jerusalem and reestablishing it as their place of worship of Yahweh. And then Esther is the short story of the young Jewish girl in Babylon who becomes queen to King Artaxerxes. Interestingly enough, Esther is the only book in the Old Testament to not have the name Yahweh in it. Just an interesting little thing. Job, Song of Songs,
Back there.
Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes are wisdom literature. So it goes Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. So Job is an ancient story that deals with the problem of righteous people suffering. Probably stems from the wisdom tradition of explaining why righteous people do actually suffer, saying that it's in the Lord's hands. Probably not historical narrative. It's partially up for debate, but almost any biblical scholar will argue for the fact that it's wisdom literature, that it's a fictional story. That's not a problem to us, whether it is or not. Just an interesting debate topic. Then we've got Ecclesiastes, which represents the thoughts of its author, the Koheleth, or the teacher, who believes that it's meaningless, that life is meaningless until you take God into consideration. So very much a wisdom tradition of Israel. Then we've got the Book of Psalms and the Song of Songs, which are the two books of poetry. So the Book of Psalms contains 150 psalms, and when you're referring to any specific one, you say Psalm 3, Psalm 20. A lot of people make the mistake and say Psalms 20, but it's the Book of Psalms with individual psalms, Psalm 3, Psalm 4. And then finally, the prophetic literature in the Old Testament. So we've got the major prophets, named that for their size, not for their importance, the size of the books. We've got Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, which are the major prophets, and Lamentations is written by Jeremiah, or more of Jeremiah's sayings, probably written by a scribe of some sort. So we've got, those are the major prophetic books, and then we have the 12, which are the minor prophets. So prophetic literature is, of course, very interesting in and of itself, and what we'll probably do with the kids is, hopefully, we'll pepper that into the historical narrative portions, because the prophets were mentioned, almost all of them, in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And so for the kids to get an idea of what the job of the prophet was, which was to tell the people, and especially the king, hey, you're not living the way Yahweh commanded us in the law, we got to change or he's going to send us away from the land. Those are very much historical occurrences, even though they're prophetic books. And so to read those along with the historical narrative is extremely helpful for placing them instead of just as generic prophetic writing, because they definitely have a historical context, which will be important to remember. And we'll get into the New Testament after that. So we've got the Gospels, which you're all familiar with. They are their own genre. So they're not necessarily historical narrative. They're actually considered biographical narrative. And there's going to be some interesting differences that we'll get into once we hit the New Testament next year. Of course, Romans through Jude are epistles, letters written by various church leaders, Paul, Peter, Jesus' brother James, Jesus' brother Jude, the Johannine community, and the unknown author of Hebrews. So they were written to churches or individuals, and then we've got the Revelation of John, which is apocalypse. That's the genre, and we'll get into that as well, maybe in a couple years from now when we finally get there. So that's a brief overview of where we're going to be going so that you guys feel comfortable to make sure if the kids ask, is the gospel a true story, or a historical is what we're calling it for the 4th and 5th graders. Is that historical as well? And you can say, well, kind of, but it's biography, which means the story of a person's life as opposed to the story of an entire nation. So just wanted to make sure you guys are prepared with where we're going. And so all that to say, there are many, many different genres in the biblical literature. A lot of times you're going to find mini genres within genres. So in the Gospels, you're going to find the genre of parable, which of course you have to interpret very differently than the historical narrative, than the biographical narrative. And so we'll get into a little bit more of those when we do hit those books. So our goal is to determine the tools of interpretation for each genre. That way we're interpreting them correctly, because you can't interpret the Psalms the same way you're going to interpret Genesis. You just can't. You can't interpret the prophets the same way you interpret the law. They're very different. And a lot of times we get ourselves into trouble, and you see it all the time, where you interpret a certain genre as if you were interpreting a different genre, and you can put the genre of law principle that it's not for us today, and accidentally put that into a historical narrative when you are pulling out a moral principle and say it doesn't apply. There's a lot of different ways that I've seen people cross-reference genre tools. So we're going to go through them individually to make sure that we're using the right tools on the right books.
Can you give an example of that?
Of misusing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a more common one would probably be interpreting law as an epistle. So an epistle is a direct instruction to the church. So you read Paul's epistles, and they're very much applicable for our lives. I'm sure you've seen plenty of people read through Leviticus and try to apply it exactly the same, thinking that these laws are instructions for the life of the church, when actually you have to interpret the law as a covenant between God and Israel, very much a historical document, more than instructions for the life of God's people in general, which is what the epistles are. So there's one example right there. Yeah, I can next week, if you want, I can come up with a lot of good examples that I see and email you guys. That'd be a really interesting read, I think. So we've got the Pentateuch. Let's dive into that, because that's what we're going to be teaching for the next few months with the kids. Pentateuch is Greek for 5 scrolls. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. The Jews call it the Torah, which means law, literally law, even though about half of it is historical narrative, and we will get into that, why they call it the entire thing the law. So let's start with how we interpret law first, because it's going to be a little quicker. So the Old Testament law is actually a covenant, which we discussed last week. It's a relational and social contract that was made in order to keep peace, to keep order, and to signify a sovereign with a vassal. The vassal serves the sovereign based on these terms, and the sovereign provides protection and other benefits for the vassal. That is what Old Testament law was designed to be. So the word testament means covenant. So the Old Testament is the Old Covenant, and the New Testament is the New Covenant. So in the Old Covenant, God was the sovereign, Israel was the vassal, of course, and Exodus through Deuteronomy contains all the parts of a standard ancient covenant that you would find in any culture from the Middle East in that time. I won't go through all 6 parts in detail, because that would be just a little much, so I'll just cover the most important ones. So we've got the listing of the 2 parties at the beginning, Yahweh and Israel, an explanation of how they came into covenant together. When Yahweh says, I brought you up out of Egypt, that was the beginning of the Mosaic covenant, or the law. The stipulations of the covenant, which are the actual laws listed throughout Exodus, Leviticus, some in Numbers, and then Deuteronomy summarizes those 3 books and the laws found therein. The witnesses, which is Yahweh himself is a witness. Normally there would be other witnesses, and the Pentateuch actually calls heaven and earth witnesses of this covenant. So basically saying this is a cosmic covenant, not just a covenant between man and man, where witnesses would be other men, but between God and his people Israel, and now the witness is the entire world, the entire cosmos, as well as Yahweh himself. Then there are the sanctions, which are the blessings and the curses that are derived from either following the covenant or not following the covenant, and that is land. So the sanctions are, if you follow my covenant, you will dwell in the promised land, I will be your God, you will be my people, and I'll make sure you dwell there as long as you follow my stipulations. The curses were, if you do not follow these stipulations, I will kick you out of the promised land, which eventually, after many, many years of his grace and his mercy, and not kicking them out of the land, they disobeyed the covenant so much that first Israel was exiled, and then the southern half, Judah, was exiled, as I'm sure you know. But that was all tied back into Deuteronomy, where he says these are the stipulations of the covenant, and these are the sanctions of the covenant. So, while we are not required to keep the law, it's important to read and understand the law, because the rest of the Old Testament story hinges around this law. So as you get through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, you see different kings, different leaders of Israel stop following the law, and the repercussions that the authors of those books state because of the sanctions in the law, because of the stipulations in the law. So understanding God's relationship to his people is super crucial, and the law is that relationship. It basically defines their relationship to God. So it gives color to the rest of the Old Testament, which is why it's important to read. So another interesting concept about interpreting it is that sometimes you'll remember, when reading the law, that Jesus stated that not the least stroke would be changed in the law until heaven and earth passes away. So you get some people who interpret that and say, oh, well, Jesus said the law would never pass away, so obviously we still have to obey these laws. And you see some people get some pretty funky beliefs out of that. But what we have to remember is that he said that the law would not pass away until heaven and earth passed away, but he never said that as Christians we were still to live under that law. He said that he actually fulfilled the purpose of the law, and the purpose of the law was covenant, the relationship between God and Israel. And when Jesus came, he redefined that relationship between man and God through himself, through the cross. So that is why Paul says that we no longer live under the law, but we live under the law of love through Jesus Christ. It is a new law, a new covenant, and a new relationship. So the law is important for understanding the Old Testament and Israel's relationship with God, but we no longer live under that covenant. We live under the new covenant in Jesus' blood. And a good thing to remember is that only the laws that are renewed in the New Testament are applicable to us. So there are some Old Testament laws that Jesus reestablishes for his people, that Paul recommands the churches in the epistles. So the civil laws that governed Israel and the ritual laws that govern their worship are no longer applicable to us. But the moral laws, every single one of them, is repeated in the New Testament as commands to believers. So that's important to remember. And it's all summed up, as Jesus said, the entire law and the prophets is summed up in love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. So, and then the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. This fulfills the law and the prophets, is what Jesus said. So by living in love, you fulfill the purpose of the covenant, which is relationship, and the letter of the covenant, the letter of the law, is not important to us in our daily lives. It's just important for understanding God's relationship with Israel. So the law portions of the Pentateuch can't be directly applied to our lives, so their interpretation is very simple. The historical narrative portions are a little bit more in depth. So you've got to use a little bit more complex tools when looking at the historical narrative parts. You can't just directly apply a historical narrative to your life because it's just a story. There are no commands given to you. So one important thing to remember as we go through the narratives is that there's 3 levels of narrative. We've got the top level, which is the grand story of God's plan for the entire cosmos from beginning to end. The entire Bible is one meta-narrative that's driven by the individual narratives. And every individual narrative ultimately points toward that great cosmic meta-narrative that God is weaving throughout the entire cosmos. So this level is often referred to as redemptive history. Reading through individual narratives, you'll look at how it points to God's redemptive history of all people at all times, and that's Old Testament all the way through New Testament. How the Old Testament points forward to Jesus, how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament. That's the redemptive history, the top level. So the middle level then, one rung down, is God redeeming a specific people for his name. In the Old Testament, that's Israel, and every passage points to God's plan for Israel and their role in glorifying his name in front of the nations. So top level's meta-narrative, middle rung is going to be how do these individual stories point to God's using Israel to glorify himself in front of the nations, in view of the nations, spreading light to the Gentiles, like he says. And then finally, the bottom level is obviously the individual narratives as they are. They're stories about the men and women of Israel, histories. They are, we believe as Christians, that they are true histories of Israel. When Jesus says that the scriptures testify about him, he's speaking of the top level, the meta-narrative, which is important to understand because he's not obviously saying that every individual story is a testament about him. He's saying that all together, taken as a whole, the meta-narrative is about Jesus, which is going to be important to remember as we interpret. And that's going to be the major focus of the Gospel Project. The Old Testament, every lesson that we teach the kids is going to have a little gospel point, a little point back to Jesus. And so that's going to be important to remember that every individual story doesn't have Jesus in it, but every individual story points to the meta-narrative that points to Jesus. So another important thing we got to go over is how historical narrative cannot be interpreted. Here are some more specific examples of ways that we can't interpret them. So one thing they're not is allegories or stories with hidden meanings that we have to uncover and uncode. They might be difficult to understand at times, that's true. But ultimately, the rule of interpretation is that a passage can never mean what it didn't mean to the original audience. So people who try to find special allegories in certain stories and say, oh, well, I thought of a good example this week and now it's gone. I should have written it down. To say that, Abraham signifies God and Isaac signifies Jesus, and because Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac and didn't, now we're going to extract that into a broader scope of, actually Jesus was, some, not true Christians, but there are people who say, Jesus was actually substituted on the cross for another person and he didn't actually die because God can't die. Different things like that. There are no secret hidden meanings in Old Testament stories that change our view of theology. What it says is what it says, and the difficulty in interpretation probably comes from not understanding the historical context, not because there's a deeper hidden meaning. Another thing that they're not intended to do is teach a moral lesson. That is very important because I feel like in kids ministry, that's what we are so tempted to do. To say, see, this person did it the wrong way, and see the wrong choice got bad results for them, so you shouldn't make wrong choices because you're going to get bad results. Now that's true, and of course the historical narratives are accurate historical stories, so they're going to show truth in that when you make a bad decision, you get a bad result, but that is not their purpose. A lot of times we think that is their main purpose, or their only purpose, when that's actually a very secondary purpose. Like I said earlier, the main purpose of each individual narrative is to point to God. It's to teach us something true about Him, to teach us something about the way that He relates to people, to His people Israel, and also to us. So when we go through historical narrative, the main purpose of every single story is God. He's the main character, and the individuals in the story are the secondary characters. So while we can still bring up the points that, this didn't work out well for this person because they lied or whatever, or probably won't go into David and Bathsheba, but big mistakes by people who love the Lord and the bad results, we can bring those up, but those can never be the main point. That's behavioralism, and it's a moralistic reading of the narratives, which was not their original purpose. So those direct moral teachings can be found elsewhere in the Bible, so they don't need to be taught in the narratives. We're not actually losing anything by taking that out of our interpretation. We can actually point to those places, say, Paul says this, or the Lord said through one of the prophets this. This is just a generic truth about right and wrong that is true about God. And this story kind of shows that as an example, as a side point, but it is not the purpose of that story. The purpose is to show something about what God is like. Another one is that unlike modern narrative, the Hebrew narratives are pretty much completely unconcerned with painting a visual image. So any visual image or any visual information that you're given from the story is going to be important to the plot line. It's not just there for fluffer, like in English writing. It's not there to give you a better portrait of it. It's actually going to have some significant meaning. So when you get described a physical detail of a character, make sure you ask yourself why. Why are they describing this person physically? The details that are more just there to give you information and not necessarily to drive the plot line are things like their status, which was more important in the ancient world, whether a person was wise, wealthy, etc., their profession, baker, cupbearer, etc., or their tribal designation, like Midianite, Philistine, or a Danite, or something like that. So those aren't quite as important for the plot line. Those are more the information, those are the details that would have been more interesting to the people back then. So visual details, important for plot. Other details like status, profession, and tribal designation may or may not be important to the plot. That's more like our visual details in today's stories that we read. So here are some tools for interpret. Those are things that we've got to be careful to not read into them. Here are some important things that we can read into them. As you read, pay attention to changes of scene as you go through stories, because each story is made up of smaller segments, and each change from scene to scene drives the plot, which can give you an idea of the purpose that the author is writing the entire passage as a whole. So in the story of Joseph, when you go from scene to scene, it's giving you an idea of his overall purpose. So pay attention to scene changes and weaving scenes together. Another one is that, like I said, characters and their visual details aren't as important. God is the main character. Secondary characters aren't quite as important for the plot line, so characters aren't going to drop. But one thing we do have to note about characters is that a lot of times they're contrasted or compared. So we've got similarities and differences that are put into different characters that we are supposed to pay attention to, again, to get to that main purpose that the author's trying to get to. That is our goal when we interpret the Bible. What is the main purpose of the author? So we've got Joseph standing in contrast to his brothers, which is super important throughout the entire passage of Joseph, because at the beginning he says, I'm going to be here. His brothers don't like that. Joseph's maybe making a bonehead move, but he's got good intentions. His brothers have bad intentions. In the end, we see that contrast come around full circle. Now he actually is over his brothers, and he's showing that grace to them. That's teaching us something about the purpose of that passage. And then we have similarities that we can also draw, like John the Baptist and Elijah are parallel characters, that John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah to fulfill the Old Testament. So watch out for relationships between characters that drive the plotline, not necessarily actions of the characters themselves, which is very different from modern narratives. Another one is that the narrator gives you information you need to know about the characters, most often through dialogue, which happens a lot in modern writing as well. That is one similarity we have. The narrator prefers more of a backseat role almost throughout historical narrative, whereas in today's story, you get a lot of different detail from the narrator just telling you something in a story. Almost all of it in historical narrative is going to be done through the character's dialogue, as opposed to just being straight up told by the narrator, to the point where you almost forget there is a narrator. So it's important to remember that the narrator is actually telling you a story. They're just doing it through more dialogue by the characters. So a lot of times the entire the entire purpose of a narrative can be found in one or two speeches by one of the characters, like at the end when Joseph says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Boom. There's the point. The narrator didn't tell us, one of the characters did. So that's important to remember. Another one is that you may have noticed by reading the Bible, the plot lines move along much faster in Hebrew narrative than in modern narrative. So if the narrator chooses to slow down and pay attention to one scene or one dialogue or one detail, make sure you pay close attention to why the narrator is slowing it down, because that wasn't a normal, that's normal for us when we read a book. That wasn't normal for Hebrew narrative. So they're definitely trying to get at something important if you notice that the narration is slowing down. And then another last big important thing to look for, I know this is a lot of information, is repetition. Repetition is huge in all sorts of different Hebrew genres. It's the same in narrative. So highlighting a certain aspect of something was almost always done through repetition of some sort. And in particular, look for inclusions. So inclusion is when something is said at the beginning of a passage, and then it is repeated at the end of a passage, and that was a very common Hebrew literary tool to say, hey, this is the main point. Everything in the middle reflects the inclusionary statements. So that is one of the most important types of repetition that you can notice, and that will help highlight and interpret the material in the middle, and they actually can't be separated from one another. That's another big mistake people make, and that actually even holds true in the Gospels, that when you have an inclusion, the beginning and end aspect, whatever is being highlighted, defines the middle part. It gives light to the middle part, and sometimes people will try to interpret the middle part not in light of the inclusion. So making sure that if there's an inclusion, you use it to interpret whatever's in the middle, because it can't be interpreted without the inclusion. So that is the Pentateuch and our historical narrative and our law portions. I know that was a really quick thing, but any questions?
Are these notes going to be online this week?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and post this video. I can email you all my notes too,
Okay.
along with the video. Yeah, and if you have a desire to learn more about genre and digging into it and interpreting it, the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Fee and Stewart are the names of the authors. Great book. It's where I got a lot of this information, and they walk through each different style of genre and even a few subgenres like parable, and go through the main things that you can do wrong and the main things you can do right when interpreting those genres. So I highly recommend that book. I've got 2 copies, so if anyone wants to borrow mine, you're welcome to. Anything else? Questions? Barely finished with time to get ready. All right, well, thanks guys.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you.
Yeah.